Hello and welcome to our live coverage of the 1997 Booker Prize for Fiction. As usual, we're at the Great Hall of the Guildhall in the City of London, where publishers, critics, literary lions, authors, the great and the good of literary London, and possibly even a few readers have assembled to find out who will win the £20,000 prize, as well as the glory and the increased sales figures that go with it. John Berger once promised to give half his prize money to the Black Panthers, even though they'd been disbanded 2 years earlier. Malcolm Muggeridge dropped out of being a judge because he said the entries were too sexy. Anthony Burgess said he wouldn't turn up on the night unless he was certain he'd won. The book is now in its 29th year, and although it may no longer be the biggest literary prize, it's the one that carries the most weight, and it's always attracted the most gossip. Most years, the shortlist attracts debate by leaving off a highly fancied novelist, and this year it's followed tradition by omitting Ian McEwan's Enduring Love, among others. The judges have read their way through 106 novels over the past few months, and they decided only an hour ago who would win out of 6 shortlisted authors, all of whom are here in the Guildhall with us tonight. The judges know whom they've chosen, but none of the rest of us do, least of all the long-suffering shortlisted authors. Jim Crace from Birmingham has won several literary prizes in the past. He's been shortlisted for Quarantine, an account of the time that Jesus spent in the wilderness of Judea. Mick Jackson from Brighton is here for his first novel. The Underground Man is an account of the eccentric subterranean constructions of a 19th century duke. Bernard MacLaverty is an Irishman who now lives in Glasgow. Grace Notes, set in both Ireland and Scotland, is about the developing talent of a young composer. Tim Parks lives in Italy, and his odyssey, Europa, follows a coach trip of academics from Milan to Strasbourg. Arundhati Roy lives in New Delhi, but was born in Kerala. The God of Small Things is her first novel, and it's set in and around a pickle factory in southern India. Madeleine St. John's from Australia, but she now lives in London, and the essence of the thing is about a couple separating in Notting Hill Gate. In my opinion, these 6 books could have made it onto many previous shortlists, and 2 at least match several winners from the past. The Booker has also uniquely become the Bookies Prize. This year the odds are evenly spread and there's no clear favourite, although the betting's leaning slightly to Bernard MacLaverty. I'm about to go down to the crypt to discuss the novels, leaving events up here in the capable hands of Muriel Gray.
Thank you, Melvin. Mind the steps. Now, 45 minutes to go now, and the guests are already picking spinach from their teeth, ready to smile beatifically at whoever walks off with this year's £20,000 prize. But earlier on, when the blood sugar levels were still low enough to make them edgy and opinionated, I talked to some of them as they were arriving.
I've read the shortlist, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that my favourite will win.
Which is it?
It never does.
Oh, which is your favourite? Tell us.
It's the complex, difficult one about Palestine, about the 40 days in the wilderness.
Well, Bernard MacLaverty's been favourite all the way through since the shortlist at 2-1. Arundhati Roy has been very well backed, down to 9-4 from 7-2. Jim Crace is third favourite at 7-2. Then there's Mick Jackson at 5-1. Tim Parks 6-1, and the outsider of the party, Madeleine St. John at 8-1.
The one I enjoyed most is The Underground Man by Mac Jackson. I think it's a remarkable book about an eccentric duke and the tunnelling. It's probably too eccentric to win this prize.
I hope that Bernard MacLaverty wins. I have an axe to grind because I really do think that Peter Carey's Jack Maragg should have been on it, but that's just me carping. But I hope that Bernard MacLaverty wins. It's a very good novel.
I think Jim Crace is a good thing.
Now, the Booker judges used to decide the winner of a prize a while before the announcement, but the result always leaked out. So this year, the system was changed so that the final meeting only took place this very evening. White smoke was seen emerging from the chimneys at 8 o'clock, and all the judges have been kept incommunicado ever since. Now, in the chair, Gillian is Professor of English Literature and President of Clare College, Cambridge. Dan Jacobson is a novelist and Professor Emeritus at University College London. Jason Cowley is a journalist at The Times. Jan Dalley is the literary editor of The Independent and Sunday, and Rachel Billington is a novelist, journalist and critic. So for the authors, those are the only people whose opinions count. But down in the austerity of the crypt, Melvin's talking to a team of alternative experts.
Down here, I'm joined by A.S. Byatt, who won the Booker in 1990 with her novel Possession, Carmen Khalil, the publisher, who chaired last year's judges, and the novelist and critic Will Self. We're going to start by looking at 2 first novels that have been shortlisted, Mick Jackson's The Underground Man and The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy.
Describing what The God of Small Things is about is something that I've resisted doing because I believe that a story is the simplest way of presenting a complex world, and I can't really simplify it any further. For me, it's a way of seeing, a way of presenting the world. So I won't tell you what it's about. I will say that it's set in Kerala in South India. Most of the action takes place over a period of one day in 1969, but other threads of the narrative move across several years. The main characters are a pair of twins, Esteban and Rahel, who are 31 years old when the story opens, and they've last seen each other when they were 7 in 1969. They never did look much like each other, Esther and Rahel, and even when they were thin-armed children, flat-chested, worm-ridden, and Elvis Presley puffed, there was none of the usual who's who and which is which, from the over-smiling relatives or the Syrian Orthodox bishops who frequently visited the Imanum house for donations. The confusion lay in a deeper, more secret place. In those early amorphous years, when memory had only just begun, when life was full of beginnings and no ends, and everything was forever, Esteban and Rahel thought of themselves together as me, and separately, individually, as we or us, as though they were a rare breed of Siamese twins, physically separate but with joint identities. Now, these years later, Rahel has a memory of waking up one night, giggling at Esther's funny dream. She has other memories too, that she has no right to have.
The Underground Man is the story of an eccentric Victorian aristocrat who builds a network of tunnels under his estate so that he can come and go without being seen. It's based very loosely on the life of the 5th Duke of Portland and takes the form of a journal written in the Duke's old age when both his mind and his body are beginning to fail.
Shafter's gone to sea, silver buckles on his knee. He'll come back and marry me, Bobby Bobby Shafter.
Sang mainly ballads returning home, my father's bird song, and an old sea shanty. Amused myself with the thought of the cows above, lazily munching in an empty field, and the sound of some old fellow coming up from the ground, roaring on about the rolling waves and the hunt for the great white whale. All in all, a most satisfactory day. I'm sure tonight I will sleep like a top, but something has been troubling me. As I looked back just now on the day's events and saw me striding down the western tunnel, I saw not a man who strode along on his own. I had the impression that, how can I put it, that I had company with me. Not entirely visible, perhaps, but company just the same. A young fellow who generally hangs about.
There were, I suppose, certain themes I set out to explore along the way, to do with illness and ageing and the persistence of memory. But essentially, the book is simply the diary of a man who finds himself increasingly at odds with his own body, someone who slowly slips from eccentricity into madness.
This has had a good of small things. It's had tremendous success. I believe it's been translated into 30 languages. Hey, Aspired, what's your view of it?
I feel completely double about it. I think it's an absolutely brilliant structural work for a first novel. I think the plotting is extraordinary. She tells you the end and the dreadful thing that's going to happen, and then makes you wait and wait and wait to see how it happened. And the skill with which that is done is both delightful and, to a certain extent, irritating, because you feel that the author is pushing you around and controlling you. That said, I got very put out and exhausted by the overwriting. She loads every rift with ore and then loads it again and then loads it again. And I know it's about the sensibility of two small children, and she does convincingly make them into two very bright small children who play with language, and they're Indian children playing with the English language. But all the same, she just writes too many words. There are too many capital letters. There are too many puns, too many jokes, and you just feel battered by writing.
Will Self, what's your view?
Yes, I think if you're going to freight a novel with new coinages, and her particular one is the double adjectival things. Everything's kind of metal clinking or kind of, you know, car thumping as one word. That you really have to go to the hilt. You either have to kind of play the Joycean game to the limit or not at all. I think that's a danger of that kind of prose. I think that the novel, in a sense, suffers from a cookie-cutter image of what the subcontinental Indian novel should do, and I think that the reader starts to...
What do you exactly mean by that cookie-cutter image of what the...
Well, I can only really sum it up by saying that when the kind of child abuse happens in the book, you know the incest is coming soon, you know. It's that sort of sense about the way in which the narrative is driving. I did like the way in which the narrative developed, the circumlocutory sense of the scenes feeding back into this day. I thought that was very good. I'm not as antagonistic towards that highly coloured prose as some writers are. I actually don't mind it in a way. I like to be teased and excited by language in that way. But that's what I'm saying. I'm saying, in a sense, this novel suffers by comparison, and that's perhaps not a fair way of judging it.
Carmen Khalil.
I found this novel very hard to take because of the language and the writing. I actually found the plot, which Antonio admired, very derivative, so that everything that happened I'd read 1,000 times before, particularly the long-lost lovers, you know, across the river, one-armed and all the rippling muscles underneath, that sort of thing. But what really disturbed me was the quality of the writing. I just cannot understand how anyone who uses the English language so much like a sort of oversweet sticky pudding could really be on the Booker Prize shortlist. It seems to me an astonishment, because I don't think the storytelling talents, which are considerable, make up for everything else that's lacking in the novel.
Are you surprised finally on this one, Aspired, that this is on the shortlist? Most people were tipping her to sort of win it a few months ago, as soon as the book came out.
I read all the hype, and one has to be very careful not to be put off by hype. I started, and I have to admit this, antagonistic to this book, because I'd read so much about it. I thought it can't be as good as they say, and I don't think it is. I really don't think it is. And I have tried very justly and carefully to think about this. I do think it's derivative. I think it's derivative from Garcia Marquez and from Salman Rushdie. I also, at some deep level, wasn't moved by it, and I do wish to be moved by novels. I didn't care really what happened to the people, and that is a minus.
Carmen Khalil, Mick Jackson's first novel, another first novel, The Underground Man, loosely based on the Duke of Portland in the 19th century, an eccentric, yet another eccentric English duke. What did you make of that?
I liked this novel. When I say I liked it, I couldn't see anything wrong with it at all. It's got a good plot, tells a very good story. He writes more than adequately. There's some wonderful moments in it. But it isn't exceptional in any way. And I thought it was a very interesting example of a novel that shouldn't have been chosen, I'm afraid, once again, for the writer's sake. Because I think he's a writer who will do very well and write books that are have more to offer than this one, which I think has a sort of, it's over-organised and over-set up. You can see everything coming.
We are talking about two first novels, aren't we? Will Self.
Well, I think the problem with Mick Jackson's book, for me, was that it represented a subgenre. I mean, in a sense, literary fiction should be outside of genre. It's everything that isn't a thriller, that isn't a romance. But in a way, this, for me, was a subgenre of creative writing novels. I mean, there was kind of nothing wrong in that sense, but the great kind of god of creative writing novels is Waterland by Graham Swift, which came out of the kind of crux of English creative writing teaching. And in a way...
You're not speaking in a complimentary way of these books.
Well, I think actually Waterland's a great book, but I saw this book, The Underground Man, as being rather in its shadow, as being this kind of passing off of the coinage of history as relevance. And I think it's a retreat from what fiction should really be doing.
Antonio Byard.
It never occurred to me to compare it with Waterland. I agree with Carmen. It's a sort of small, elegant novel that achieves what it sets out to do. I think he has a lovely ear for the kind of meditative noise that people made writing both letters and fiction at that period.
Well, thank you all. We'll be back in a couple of minutes to look at more of the contenders for this year's Booker Prize. Thank you all very much.
Well, welcome back to the Booker Prize, live from the Guildhall in London. Behind me, the large tuxedoed herd of guests are still scoffing, while the poor 6 nervous shortlisted finalists are probably just pushing their peas around their plate. Now, The Guardian printed an article a couple of weeks ago that said, it goes without saying that the literary world is small, vengeful and self-absorbed. Obviously quite unlike journalism then. Well, Tom Mashler, you began the Booker Prize in 1969, and journalists have been very, very mean every year, acting as if the Booker Prize were organised by Satan himself. Why are they so upset?
Well, there's always something that they're mean about. Take this year, they're particularly mean about the shortlist. They're mean about the fact that a bunch of writers, rather important writers, very important writers, like John Bandel, Peter Keri, for example, Rose Tremaine, Michelle Roberts, and Ian McEwan are not on the shortlist. And if you think about it, before the shortlist was announced, Ian McEwan was the favourite, not to be on the shortlist. He was the favourite to win the prize. And then his name suddenly isn't even on the shortlist. And this seems sort of perverse and strange. I must say, I don't actually think it matters that much, because the prize generates its own momentum and its own excitement, and the purpose of the prize, and the reason we founded it, was really to make fiction an important and a talked about event. Nonetheless, it is pretty strange.
And you feel that it's achieved what you set out to do then, by and large?
Yeah, I think it has very much. But I do think, as I say, every year there's some hitch, there's some odd weirdness that happens that makes it more difficult. I think it would achieve even more if the judges, who this year are very eminent and very good judges, if only they could actually include some of the most important books, or that most people feel are the most important books, which they seem to omit.
Do you ever worry about the future of the prize?
No, I don't, because I think it is so far ahead of any other prize in this country, and I think it is so fulfilled and so desired that it will succeed.
Thank you very much. Well, back to the crypt and see what Melvin thinks.
We're going to look at 2 more of the shortlisted contenders for this year's Booker Prize, Tim Park's Europa and Quarantine by Jim Crace.
In my novel Quarantine, I wanted to write a book in which all the characters are troubled, people living on the edge, people who are grieving or mad or have some kind of illness. I also wanted to write a book as we come up to the year 2000, when we're going to celebrate 2,000 years of Christian history, a book that would put Christian narrative under some kind of pressure to see whether it bends or breaks. In this book, I've managed to deal with both themes at once. It's set in that brief period when Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days to be tempted by the devil in the Judean wilderness. But in my version, he has 5 or 6 companions there with him who are also fasting as a means of dealing with their troubles. There were 5 of them, 3 men, a woman, and too far behind for anyone to guess its gender, a 5th. And this 5th one was barefooted and without a staff. The first 4, their problems, madness, cancer, infertility, had started their journeys that morning from the same settlement in the valley. Though they had observed the proprieties of pilgrimage by keeping some distance apart, they had at least endeavoured to keep each other within sight and hearing. By the time they clambered up the shifting landfall to the plateau at the top of the precipice and were walking through the flatter scrub towards the tent, they were more hesitant and slow, exhausted obviously, but also uncertain of the way, uncertain even if this quarantine were wise.
Europa, a comedy of rancour, I suppose you could call it. Jerry, 45, climbs on a coach in Milan. He's bound for the European Parliament in Strasbourg. Multinational group of colleagues are going to present a petition against the Italian state. But Jerry doesn't care about saving his job. 30 or so students have come along, all Italian, mostly girls. Somebody's christened the coach the Shag Wagon. He's come on the trip because she's on it, the woman who most loved him and most betrayed him. He wants to show that he can be around her for 3 days without becoming violent, as he did when they split up. The coach rumbles on through alpine tunnels, video screens showing American movies dubbed in Italian. The guys there chasing tail and talking pork. Welcome to the miracle of modern communications.
We filed into the Chambersy service station, built in the ubiquitous Euro architecture of curved cement and glass surfaces. with a generous bristle of flagpoles outside displaying the colours of every nationality the franchise holders hope to take money from, and inside, a sense of disorientation generated by flights of steps and walkways and signs that are no longer in any language, but just cups and knives and forks and wheelchairs and crossed-out dogs. And in fact, the moment we're through the doors, almost all the girls, none of whom is wearing a skirt, follow the sign displaying a human figure distinguishable from another human figure precisely because it is wearing a skirt, rather than trousers, reminding me of a desire I frequently used to express to her, usually immediately after we had made love, that I myself would like so much to be a woman, just for a day or a week. I would like to know what it feels like to be a woman. And this desire was, and sometimes is, a terribly real and intense desire, and part of a sort of deep biological yearning of mine, a yearning to do and to be and to have everything.
OK, let's start with Jim Crace's Quarantine. Will Self.
Well, it was interesting to see Tom Mashler kind of hedging his bet so egregiously there. It made you think of Chesterton's dictum that the English love a talented mediocrity. You know, you can have a list that in some sense doesn't represent the best of contemporary fiction, but yet it's kind of good enough to propel forward a literary prize. Before that, Muriel Gray was making a statement about the inward-lookingness of the literary world, and I must just top this up by saying that Jim Crace is a personal friend of mine, so I'm in some sense hobbled from commenting as widely as I would. If you like somebody personally, if you criticise their work, you can never have a friendship with them again. Jim said to me last night on the phone that he and I were similar writers in that our prose was divisive. And frankly, Jim, I find that a laughable idea. I don't think your prose is divisive at all. I think it's rhythmic. I think it's written in iambic pentameters. I think it's almost Shakespearean in its cadence. I think you would find it difficult to write an unacceptable book, and this is not an unacceptable book. But I found it I may say that I did like it very much. It's up there with the ones I liked, but I did find it peculiarly unadventurous at the same time. And what upset me most about it was that it didn't slow me down.
Antonia Byatt.
It was a very elegant book. The sentences were, as Will has said, extremely beautiful. It left me cold. I think Jim Crace wants to be the heir to William Golding. He writes the mythical allegory set in a strange place where somehow you're fighting out elemental spiritual battles. But Golding was brutal and blodgy and heavy, and he battered you about, and he was awkward. And Crace goes elegantly on, describing very unpleasant things in this very crystalline, clear, pure way. And every now and then, when he's describing the landscape and the wind blowing, you think, beautiful, beautiful. But the people don't bother you. Again, I've said that about earlier books, and in fact I do agree with Will. I think the whole shortlist is missing in energy.
Well, I thought that I disagree with you about some of his characters. I thought Musa and Miri and Marta were very strong characters, but Carmen Khalil.
I thought this was a wonderful novel, beautifully written, everything that the other two have said. I think there's only one problem with Jim Crace, and I think one has to ask oneself whether it is a problem really, which is that he seems to me the sort of great writer. I think he is going to be one of our great novelists, if he's not already. But he writes for himself. He doesn't write for the reader. And so this is one of those novels that people will love to read because it's a great work, but it hasn't got that capacity to go out to millions of people and thrill the heart.
Well, I'm in the position of a hideously privileged insider. I'm like the man in the pit crew wiping the sweat from Schumacher's visor. I mean, I've spoken to him about this. I remember when he started writing the book, and Jim, I think it's fair to say, is on the atheistical side of agnostic. And in a sense, he was writing a reinterpretation of the idea of Christ's ordeal in the wilderness in order to satisfy certain questions he had about his attitude towards Christianity.
Basically, as by that, we can't really leave out the word Christ in the discussion of Quarantine.
No, well, I feel that he has tried to write an anti-religious book, but actually it has a certain 19th century piety to it. It hedges its bets like 19th century novels that say, perhaps this isn't true, but the feeling is true. The feeling of the Galilean saving people's lives is true. And that made me feel quite ill. It would have been nicer if he'd have really died.
Well, 2,000 years on, we come to Europa by Tim Parks. Carmen Khalil.
This is an extraordinarily self-absorbed novel. I can seriously say that I think it's the most self-absorbed novel I've ever read in my life. The word I appears about 1,000 times, And basically, it's about this man, I, waving his penis around on a bus. He has
There's a little more to it than that.
Very
Carmen,
little.
but,
Well, I mean...
there is more to it than
No,
that.
no.
It's too good a phrase to...
Asks himself
not to utter,
questions all the time about his angst. His angst is over his lost mistress. And it is entirely full of very ill-written questions. It's not only that I objected to the plot, it's more that I objected to the writing, once again, and also to the fact that I'm told that this novel was chosen by a particular judge to put instead of Ian McEwan. And I think it's this sort of thing where we've got judges who actually can choose a book like this to irritate the women members on the panel, so I'm told.
Well, we are validating the Booker's position as the leading gossip prize, actually.
Well, no, I'm just trying to talk about why this book is on instead of sort of other books that you said we were allowed to discuss.
Yeah, we are allowed to discuss. I just wonder whether that might or might not have been the reason for including it. I mean...
Yes, but he said this, the person said this on the radio and wrote it in a newspaper.
I didn't realise that had happened.
And also told thousands of other people. I admit that that is gossip. But I do think there is a serious point here. The Booker judge, all this fuss is made about the judges, whether they've got enough to eat and are they paid enough. But in fact, these are writers we're concerned about. And I think when this sort of book is chosen, you must ask yourself why.
Will Self, Europa.
Well, I think, interestingly, this novel, which I think is closest on the list to being a novel of ideas, which interests me, I think it exhibits some of the tendencies that the other books on the list exhibit, which is the role of the novelist is to discover within the particular the general, to make the reader think when they read a phrase, a coinage or an image, that I'm hearing something expressed which is true to me, articulated in a different form. And Tim Parks seems to be trying to do that the whole time, but his coinages are a very slippery and redundant currency, rather like his riff about the European currency, and that was disturbing. But I haven't got an objection in principle to novels about middle-aged philanderers. I haven't got a problem with that.
We'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Well, welcome back. We're only a few minutes away now here at the Guildhall from knowing who exactly is going to be the winner of the 1997 Booker Prize. With me is Ben Ockery, who won it in 1991 for The Famished Roads. Ben, in real terms, what did it do for you? For instance, how many books did you actually sell on the back of the Booker?
I think the first, it sold over 80,000 copies straight away, just after the Booker Prize. But the really astonishing effect was with the paperback. I think in the first week it sold something like 100,000 copies. So it really does have a transformative effect on your readership. But that's not the most important thing. I think the most important thing is the way in which it opens for the reader the freedom to enter into your spirit.
Yeah. Okay, well, Malcolm Bradbury's also with me. Malcolm, you were a judge on the Booker. Do you think that it doesn't just have effect on current winning authors, but maybe on the next generation of authors themselves?
Yes, I think that was certainly true in the 80s when there were major writers winning the prize, Salman Rushdie and great many others. I was chairman of judges when Salman Rushdie won. And, Rushdie won. And the impact on that writing generation was massive. I think something's happened to fiction in Britain since that time. There was a high point in the 1980s. There's now the talent is more generalised, and I think there's something of that flavour in this year's list. But the prize matters. It matters to the idea of the novel, the serious novel, which includes all kinds of genre fiction as well. And it's a prize that goes on encouraging us to believe that we do need the novel.
So it's important, certainly, to everybody who's thinking of writing as well as those who have already been published.
Yes, I mean, I think the question you were asking me first has to do perhaps with the change of technique, the change of mood that went on in modern fiction.
Okay.
And the book has done it.
Right, thank you very much indeed. Back to Melbourne.
OK, last lap. We're going to talk about Bernard MacLaverty's Grace Notes and The Essence of the Thing by Madeleine St. John.
The essence of the thing concerns Nicola and Jonathan, who are a happy enough cohabiting couple, until the night Jonathan tells Nicola that their life together is over. and astounded and grieving Nicola therefore decamps bag and baggage for Clapham, forgetting only the jar of W.I. marmalade sent to her by Jonathan's unwitting mamma in Gloucestershire the previous weekend, Jonathan having then expressed his absolute indifference to the stuff.
It was a large jar, one of those £2 jobs. The contents were a rich tawny shade, almost brown, and he realised that it was exactly what he wanted to eat. Marmalade, no. This marmalade belonged to Nicola. She had forgotten it. He could put it with her other things in the bedroom for her to collect ASAP. Not now, later. Later. The toast would be cold, but it doesn't matter. He found some gooseberry jam and sat down. Sunday breakfast in the empty, silent flat. His soul was there, where it had always been. At the unlocated interface between brain and mind, it had come home. That was Nicola's marmalade, and they were not now in a shared marmalade situation. He knew he'd been right in principle, in essence. It was just the mundane details which took a bit of getting used to. Too bad about the marmalade. The balance between bitter and sweet was the essence of the thing.
The book is called Grace Notes, and it's a story of Catherine McKenna, a music graduate and aspiring composer. The book is in two parts. The first part concerns her return to the north of Ireland, where she was born, for the funeral of her father. The second half is in Scotland, partly in Glasgow, partly on the island of Islay, where she teaches music and lives with her partner, Dave. She flies off the island to Glasgow, to Rotten Row Maternity Hospital, to have her baby. Her child was so much more than Catherine's eyes could take in, although what she saw astonished her. The fingernails, the dark fluffy hair of the head, the whirl of the ear, they were all part of her, and yet they belonged to someone else, somebody totally other. It was like attending musical theory classes all her life, learning to sight read, being shown the instruments and handling them, seeing photographs of composers, reading books about harmony and counterpoint, but at no time ever hearing a single note of music. Then, on a particular day, at a particular time, after all the preparation, after all the theory and the rules and the speculation, she is led blindfold into a hall, and an orchestra explodes into the celebratory sounds of, say, the Voices entry in Handel's Zadok the Priest. And the voice of her teacher leans close to her blindfolded ear and says quietly, "That's what it is. Now do you understand?" This is what it was, Anna, her baby, lying in front of her. There was the baby she had carried inside her head, and there was the baby she had carried inside her body. They were not the same. The one in front of her was better by far.
A spy at the essence of the thing, perhaps the most bashed about of the books on the shortlist.
Yes, it's the one I got the most out of. It's the one that really excited me. I think if you read it, not as though it was by Joanna Trollope, but as though it was by Kafka, it's a book about people living in a kind of smoke of thinness. They have nothing to say. Doesn't mean they don't suffer, but it means they have no concepts. And every now and then in this book, she puts in, there's a child called Guy, which is learning about salvation at school, and all the grown-ups just laugh. They say, this is a ridiculous idea, this is an impossible idea now. And then there's one of the fathers who says, Jonathan had better get on and propagate himself. He's got to propagate the packaging. It's only the packaging of the DNA that matters. It is a thin novel about the thin world in which Darwin is more important than Christ. It says, look what we have lost. I'm not a Christian, I'm against it, but it is a post-religious novel, and it seems to me to be a much more interesting post-religious novel, actually, than Quarantine.
Will Self.
I don't really agree. I tried to get that take on it. I think if you want to look for a writer who has actually done that in terms of modern kind of ideological mores and peculiarities of belief, look to Bret Easton Ellis in America, who has mined this territory very deeply. For me, this, even if the author intended that it be a thin reproduction of a thin conceptual world, I'm the 30-something London professional on the panel. This isn't my mindscape. I don't know anybody like this. These are thin characters. It's a screenplay. It could have been written with much thinner margins. I didn't like it.
Carmen?
Well, I saw it quite differently. I thought this was a novel in the tradition of Barbara Pym and Joanna Trollope, and not as good as either. It was a very good read. It's a marvellous read for a bus or a tube or a plane. It has one drawback, which is the use, unusual in this genre of novel, of sub-Woodhouseian language, so that they talk, the Sloane Ranger people of considerable disagreeableness, and they say core and bliss and whizzy all the time, and that is a difficulty, I think. But apart from that, if you like Joanna Trollope, you'll love this novel, and I don't see why you shouldn't, because it's a jolly good read.
You do stand as a rather singular voice over this novel, Aspired.
Yes, and I really don't know if I'm quite sure that I'm right. I mean, either she is looking at core and bliss and whizzy and thinking, oh my God, what an impoverished vocabulary.
I thought they picked that word up from the kid, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I thought they picked that word up from the kid, those words up from the kid.
Yes, well, the kid, she says rather bleakly when she first introduces him, he was, in fact, very bright, she says. And he asks questions about what salvation means and gets no answer. The other thing I did want to say was that it is, although it's a thin society, it's a society in which the virtue of kindness, apart from Jonathan leaving Nicola, does persist, and that I think is true of not 30s like Will, who is extraordinary in all senses, but ordinary 30s people. They've got no beliefs left, but they're kind to each other. It's that world.
Will, can you tell us your reaction to Bernard MacLaverty's novel Grace Notes?
Fantastic prose, just brilliant. I love a man who writes about the patina of grease, of the lever of an antiquated cassette clock radio next to the stove of the parents of the protagonists at her father's funeral. I think it has marvellous epiphanies in it, this book. But at the end of the day, I didn't know Catherine McKenna, the protagonist of this book. I didn't know her. I didn't know why she decided to have Lamberg drums in her symphonic work. I couldn't understand how it related to her status as a Roman Catholic in Northern Ireland. I didn't really know what she looked like. I mean, this sounds like a very trite observation about a novel, and a friend of mine who's a critic said, well, she's a severely depressed character, but you can still evoke a severely depressed person in the physical round. That bothered me.
Carmen Khalil.
I thought it was a fine novel, well written, but I think only the first third really worked. I think once he got into the womb of Catherine and associated that with music, and particularly, I thought, with the sea, there's a very, very hard-to-take scene when she's got the baby on, like a pickaninny on her back and the waves are coming in.
I love that.
Oh. It's a third of a novel, really, from a very fine writer who's done much better.
Aspired.
I felt it was very, very beautiful, which I also feel is a criticism. It was a sort of perfectly constructed piece of writing, but it felt in the end constructed. There's a wonderful bit at the end, I don't agree with Carl, there's a wonderful bit at the end when the music is played, when he turns and turns on the image of the scallop shell as E.M. Forster might have done, and the scallop shell is the birth of Venus, it's the scallop shell of the Pilgrims, it's used to describe the shape of the music with the drums banging in. I've just judged the Irish Prize, and it's like a lot of Irish novels about returning Catholics going back to Belfast. It's a genre novel as well.
Sorry, very briskly, quickly, what do you think's going to win? Carmen?
Arundhati Roy, but I think it should be Jim Crace.
I think Crace might win.
And?
In that case, I'll go for MacLaverty. I think it's quite open.
Right, we're going to find out soon above us in the Great Hall. The Guildhall dinner is finished, and the results are about to be announced. The chairman of Booker is Jonathan Taylor.
Well, now Jonathan Taylor, the chairman of Booker PLC, is going to introduce the chair of the judging panel.
We now come to the point when Professor Gillian Beer will come forward and announce the winner of the 1997 Booker Prize. Gillian, I hope you're there.
I shall approach this announcement through the names of all the people on the shortlist, because we want to thank the writers who are on the shortlist and the many other writers who have given the judges pleasure, have been the topic of intense and copious discussion, and now go out into other readers' minds. Writers and readers are natural allies, not enemies. Sneers can keep them apart, but Booker brings them together. So, in alphabetical order, Jim Crace's Quarantine is as enigmatic and robust as its title. It's inhabited by gritty wind and by people seeking to gain a reward by a 40-day retreat. The reward may be holiness, command, or a child. Among them is Dalley, who cannot be tempted to join the systems of barter they all set up. Told in mesmeric rhythms, the work is harsh and questioning, funny as well, since its main character is a bully and a rogue who hoodwinks the pilgrims and is, in the end, hoodwinked by an alliance of women. Redemption here regains many of its older meanings. Mick Jackson's The Underground Man explores growth, the apple tree, and desuetude, the old man faltering into madness. Jackson brings this off through a curious story based on fact of an aristocrat who has a vast network of tunnels built beneath his estate. Through the old man's diaries and the recollections of his servants, a world dark, vigorous, constipated, and urgent is conjured. The interior of the body, the filaments of natural growth, the underconsciousness are all connected. And memory opens underground passageways back through his life to the source of the old man's sense of lack. Bernard MacLaverty, in Grace Notes, evokes the life of a young woman composer, honouring its turmoil and its creativity. The terrifying drums of the Orangemen in her childhood are redeemed and resisted in her symphony, with whose triumph the book ends. But the book's beginning is set 3 weeks after that ending, and in that curious loop, MacLaverty weighs his heroine's history. Triumph does not last, though music does. Tim Parks's Europa offers jaundiced comedy about the condition of Europe now. Its hero, if so he can be called, is on a long coach journey, perhaps in solidarity with his colleagues going to plead their cause in Brussels, but more likely, he thinks, because his former mistress is on the bus. The book places his sour, self-loathing, and irretrievably romantic consciousness at the centre. His thoughts swoop and burrow. The long, looping sentences persuade us into unwilling intimacy with him. The experience is sharply satirical, discomforting, but exhilarating too. Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things funnels the history of South India through the eyes of 7-year-old twins. With extraordinary linguistic inventiveness, she splices their perception as children and as devastated adults. The story she tells is fundamental as well as local. It's about love and death, about lies and laws. Her narrative crackles with riddles and yet tells its tale quite clearly. Turmoil and solitude, jokes and catastrophe engross the reader in this moving novel. Madeleine St. John's The Essence of the Thing is a serious comedy about grief. She makes the reader know what splitting up can mean. We hear the people crack and split through her frugal, perfectly poised dialogue. She hears children speak, rare in fiction. Taking a very narrow social group, she uncovers profound differences of relationship within it. The book keeps its capacity to surprise through to its Janus-faced conclusion. But in the end, our choice, unanimously, fell on Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things.
So Arundhati Roy has won the 1997 Booker Prize and probably an extremely popular choice with the reading public because it's Out of all the shortlisted winners, probably the best known to those who buy books, already an international bestseller. There she is, mounting the podium to accept her prize.
First, take a chair. Well done. Say hello to Gillian and then say a few words.
Gosh, sorry, I unlike one of the children in my book, had actually learned to control my hopes, and I haven't prepared a speech. I don't know what to say, but thank you. First of all, to my husband, Pradeep Krishan, without whom this book wouldn't have been this book. To David Godwin, thank you for everything. And thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, all my readers who've written to me some of the most beautiful letters I've ever read. And really, I can't say any more. Thank you.
Congratulations, Arundhati. It's very well done. I was going to ask you what this prize meant to you, but I can see what it means to you because you're obviously very, very emotional. You're already an international bestseller. Is this important?
It is. Well, it's just that, you know, as the days go by, you just get so wound up. And it's personally very important to me, but I do think that it is still, you know, the judgment of 5 people, and if there had been other judges, it could have been another book. And this is, you know, I don't think that it means my book is a better book than another book. You know, it's just a luckier book.
It's extremely modest of you, but you're not quite inspired by the judgment.
No, I am, but I'm just saying if there had been different judges, it might have been a different book, and I'm so lucky that they were judged. I mean, there is never, you know, universal, unanimous agreement about one book. I know that there are people who don't like my book at all.
You have said that you weren't going to write another one. Has this changed your mind?
No, the Booker Prize is about my past, not about my future. I mean, you know, I'll write another book if I have a book to write, but not because I won a prize for my last one.
Okay, well, congratulations again and enjoy the rest of the evening. Now we're going to go back downstairs to the crypts to see if that has brought any surprises from the people downstairs. Melvin.
Thanks a lot. Carmen, you had said that you thought this would win.
Yes, I did.
So no surprises to you?
No.
Will Self?
Well, actually, no surprises. I'd kind of... I do think it's a bit of a shame. I mean, it would be nice to see this prize being awarded to a novel about being here now, like Oasis, you know. It would be really nice. Perhaps we don't have the writers.
Yes, Bryant.
I wish her a great deal of luck. I think it's very dangerous to win the Booker with the first novel. It puts all sorts of pressures on you that stop you writing the next novel. But, and I also feel there's a whole string of novels I would love to mention that I wish had won instead, if I'm allowed to say that.
You are, yeah. I think it's congratulations to the winner there. I mean, a little, I think we can indulge in a little generosity. I think congratulations to her. Why, finally, Carmen, did you think she was going to win?
Because I thought, this is a hackneyed remark, but I thought the judges this year seemed to have such extraordinary taste, and this was a novel I disliked so much that this must be the one they liked. That's why I thought so, because it's got a sort of vulgarity about it that embarrasses me, and it's a personal taste. Hundreds of people like this novel, but the writing for me is execrable. I can't even pronounce the word. It's just
execrable.
It's thank you, Will. But that said, it explains the fact that this is one. Explains why a really, really great novel like The Untouchable by John Banville, or very, very fine novel Peter Keri's Jack Maggs, hundreds of others weren't on this list because it's not a list for writers.
Well, there you are. That's all from this year's Booker Prize from the Guildhall in London. Until next year, goodbye.